All right. Good morning, everyone. How are you guys doing today? Good? All right. So we'll get started. We'll let more people coming in, but we'll get started on this. We had an interesting subject today. We're going to talk about GDPR. How many of you know about GDPR? Show of hands. Good. How many of you guys are actually doing something to address GDPR? Great, great. And this is a great response. So what we're going to do today is we're going to cover some of the aspects, introduction into GDPR, some of the aspects that might pertain to big data, how you can potentially manage them, and then we're going to wrap up with a demo and on some of the concepts that we're going to talk about today. Okay, but it's no means a comprehensive overview. There are a lot more to GDPR than what we're going to do today, but this gives you an idea and checklist to get started, and that's our idea. So. Brief introductions. My name is Balaji Ganesan. I'm a CEO with a startup called Privacera. We focus on helping enterprise manage risks with sensitive data. Previously, I used to lead security at Hortonworks some time back, and I was one of the founders of the Apache Ranger project. And with me, my colleague, Shrikant Venkat. Shrikant is Senior Director at Hortonworks, part of the product management team, leading work in security and governance in Horton as well as in the broader open source community. Okay. So let's get started on a quick intro, couple of slides on some of the concepts we're going to talk about today on the tech. Ranger, if you guys are not aware, Ranger is a centralized framework for security built in open source, has a central authorization framework with plugins across various Hadoop components. It has a way to capture audits and present it back to the user. Ranger also has a key management tool which works with HDFS encryption. Quick on Atlas. Atlas is a pretty comprehensive work done in the open source community to address big data challenges around lineage and metadata. So Atlas in its core provides a metadata store it provides a UI to search that deep integrations with different Hadoop components as well as vendors who can get and query data but also publish metadata into it. We'll have more things on Atlas in subsequent sessions, but Ranger, Atlas have a very deep integration that can work together in terms of classification of how you can classify data. So Atlas is a way to tag data. Ranger inherits the data and uses that for classification-based policies. So you can classify data and ensure that data is always protected using Ranger. Ranger also has dynamic authorization capabilities in terms of prohibition, time-based, and dynamic. Okay. Just quick on Privacera part, we focused completely on sensitive data aspect. How do we manage the risks around that? We help enterprises discover sensitive data in their systems. We then track how the sensitive data is being copied or transformed or moved across and how the risks are spreading. And then we detect behavior, user behavior, both from a security violations or compliance violations. We have a baseline and we detect behavior and anomalies. And then we protect data. We work with enforcement engines, encryption or masking engines to protect that data. So what is GDPR? I'm sure some of you have raised hands who will be familiar with this, so I'll be really quick. GDPR is a regulation which was enacted last year by the European Parliament and Council. It replaces the existing data protection directive which has been in place. There were some challenges with the data protection directive where the policies were not uniform across EU member states, and also the fact that it was a directive. It was not binding on companies to actually follow that. And GDPR is a step towards actually rectifying some of those concerns. It's now actually a regulation. It comes with its own penalties for potential violations, and these penalties can be pegged to revenues and pretty significant. But what aspects of GDPR is it pertains to personal data. Personal data is data that identifies an individual. It pertains to personal data in EU. So any company collecting or processing personal data from EU individuals will be under effect of GDPR. It doesn't matter if the company is in EU or is a US-based company or outside. If you're collecting data from EU individuals, personal data, you will be under GDPR. So besides penalties, GDPR also brings in a lot of rights to data subjects or individuals. And that's one of the far-reaching consequences of GDPR that we're going to see in the next few years. We're going to cover some of those aspects, but the rights includes right to consent, right to be forgotten, right to access to data. There are a lot of rights the individual has and they have control over their personal data. quickly on Privacy Shield, this Privacy Shield replaces the Safe Harbor Agreement, which was in place. This applies to data transfer between EU and US. So if you are a global company of your data centers in both places, this will apply to you. The key difference between GDPR and Privacy Shield is Privacy Shield is focused on just the data transfers part, and it's a certification process. GDPR is a much comprehensive regulation, and it handles all aspects of how the personal data is processed, managed within the enterprises. And obviously, it gives a lot of rights for the data subjects to access to the data and control how the data is being processed. If you look at in GDPR awareness, and some of you are already doing it, which is great. What we are finding in the market is the awareness is just starting to rise within the companies, but companies still are not prepared in the way they should be. In a recent survey, 1 in 3 companies felt confident on their GDPR strategy. And it's obviously the number is going to improve. But awareness is there. The awareness of GDPR is there, but not many people are aware of what exactly GDPR means. Especially if you go out of EU into US-based companies which are dealing with EU citizens, the awareness is kind of dipping. So there's a lot of work in the community we are doing to educate on GDPR and the risks. But as companies, we always recommend to start doing work on GDPR right now. Even though it's going to get effect in 2018, May of 2018, it's not far away. There's a lot of work to be done here. And we'll talk through some of the aspects today. So the aspects we think were relevant to GDPR, again, it's not a comprehensive list. GDPR is a huge regulation. But the aspects we think is relevant to you, all of you who are looking at big data, is aspects around, how do you measure breaches and how do you measure the notification of it? How can you capture consent for the data? How do you there are restrictions on automated profiling, as well as there is right to be forgotten and data portability regulations. So these are some aspects. Obviously, there's more. So at this point, I'm going to transfer to Srikanth, who is going to walk over some of this in more detail.
Thanks, Balaji. Right. Thanks, everyone. So let's get through some of the boring legal stuff here very quickly. Then we can go into the demo, which is probably more fun for most of you. So one of the first burdens that GDPR imposes is this whole notion of breach notifications. And there's a 72-hour limit within which you're supposed to notify of any breaches that you're aware of as a processor or as a controller. So the specific things here that are recommended in the legislation around pseudonymization of the data, encryption of the data, and assuring the very classic CIA, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the data, as well as the timeliness of that breach notification. And what that means is how can you manage this information? There is a notion of a data protection officer that most of these entities will need to create, and there is a need to invest in data discovery solutions that can help you understand where the sensitive data was that got breached, and that includes things around data at rest encryption, as well as dynamic masking or other masking, static masking type of capabilities. And of course, if the data gets replicated within your environments, then you need to be aware of where that's all gone through and then where it is being breached from. Okay. The second aspect, which is the cornerstone of this legislation, is the sole notion of consent. So this is more of an opt-in. So every piece of data that you're collecting, you need to declare the purpose, and also how you're going to process, you need to declare. And there's very specific aspects of the regulation around what this consent means and how long it's valid. So a subject can revoke this consent, and there is a timeline. At the time that you're collecting the consent, there is also a notion of the expiration of the consent. So all of these need to be kept in mind as you collect all this private data from your subjects. The other key aspects here, there's like two exclusions here. One is around the parental consent for minors, and the second one is around deceased folks, and those are explicitly excluded from this. The other key point here to note is also subjects have the ability to withdraw the consent at any time, and that has to be honored in how you process the data in your environments. So what this entails to the organizations is you need to have a well-managed process for collecting, managing this, and establishing and declaring what the purpose for which you're collecting the data. And also, the flip side of that is that you need to have appropriate access controls and policies in place so that the consent is used for those explicit purposes that it was requested for. Okay. There are also specific restrictions around what data can be profiled, how users can be profiled. So this automated processing, any kind of automated processing of the personal data needs to be declared and needs to be classified as profiling and is subject to a number of items of scrutiny, compliance, et cetera. And there are in the specific decision-making process or predicting the user behaviors, all of those are, there are specific restrictions in the regulation on what can and cannot be done in this area. And the key impact for any subject is that they can request or halt this. So this is the notion of stopping this notion of profiling from the user's perspective. So that has to be honored, and there's a notice period and there's an access policy around that. So what this means to the organization on the flip side is that you need to have strict process for any kind of automated data processing you're doing, and any type of analytics that are built on top of this need to ensure that there are some manual processing overrides, et cetera, that are available, so you can provably show that you have all the right controls in place to comply with that regulation. And the third key part of it, which kind of builds up on the consent, is that we need to have any kind of manual profiling should be explicitly opt-in or consent-driven. Okay. Another key burden that GDPR places is this notion of right to be forgotten and data portability. So any subject can go and say, what is all the data that you have in your enterprise, across your enterprise about me? And you need to, I want you to now forget all the data that you have about me. And at that point, the organizations are obligated to excise all that data and not have that in any of their processing streams or in any of their stores. So the idea here is that there's this right to erasure, which is a right of the data subjects, and then remove the data upon request, and also be able to be given the reasonable access to the data that the enterprises hold on their behalf or about them. And this again applies only to cases where the subject originally consented to give you that right to process that data in the first place. So what does this mean for an enterprise is you need to invest in user-centric tools that you can look at marrying these identities across your infrastructure in different places, and also need to be pay very close attention to data discovery and classification. We'll show you some of the tools that we have between Privacera and Hortonworks that can help you with some of these in the demos. So big picture here, what are the different steps that you can take as a first pass? This is not an exhaustive checklist, nor is it comprehensive in terms of being able to say that if you do these, you're in 100% compliance. It's just something to get you started and thinking about what are some basic steps that you can take in your journey towards GDPR compliance. And we kind of noted a few here. The first item here is to make sure that you have, on the legal side, notion of the protection officer, et cetera. So coordinate with your privacy and security teams, make sure you have all of this documented in terms of what process you're going to follow, what tools and systems are going to be involved in these processes. Second piece is to make sure that you have user and customer identity resolution and management systems in place before you embark on this journey. The third piece is, of course, you need to know where all this data is, so you need to have a data discovery tool, and you need to also have some governance and metadata around it, so you can do proper classifications of the data, so you know exactly these are the types of data that you have about the subjects, and this is the purpose for which you've collected the data, et cetera. And fourth pillar here is around making sure that every piece of data that you've got the appropriate consent and the purpose documented along with the data that you're collecting at any point. And the additional piece here is that once you've got the consent, you know where your data is, and you've invested in the user management solutions, the next part is to say, when do you need to pseudonymize or anonymize this to satisfy the requirements around not being able to re-identify the individuals based on that data set. So investing in suitable pseudonymization encryption type of techniques, whether it's masking or other types of operations, is key to satisfying that requirement. Then above all, the other overarching theme here is to make sure that you're monitoring all of these activities across your enterprise. So you can look at where is this personal data, where is it coming into the systems and process, where is it flowing through the organization, how is it being handled, who's touching all of those. So you need to have the constant monitoring of this data as it flows across your enterprise throughout the life cycle. And the last piece of it, which is kind of also implicit with the ability to, or the right to be forgotten, is having automated policies for data retention and recovery strategies in case you need to prove to your auditors saying, what data did you have about this subject in the past and what did you do with it? So you need to have proper recovery strategies for those once you've archived the data. So this is, at least some conceptual checklist of items that we think would be useful to kind of start thinking about how do you comply with this rather burdensome and big set of regulations that are looming as far as May 2018 goes. And now let's shift gears a little bit just to show you how we can kind of address these with the solutions that we have between Privacera and Hortonworks and the integrations we have there. So let's start with the first part, which is we'll start with consent. How do we handle the ability for organizations to specify, collect information about consent, and monitor that over time? Okay, so this is the Privacera tool. And in Privacera, these are the sets of users in your enterprise. Let's say there are a set of users here who we have noted as having consent or not. So this is think of this as your system of record in terms of how you're managing the consent. So associated with the consent is an expiration date. So there's a consent date and there's an expiration date associated with that. So in this case, you can see that this person, Anderson, has given us consent and the consent has expired because that date is in the past. There's another person here, Dandel 77, who was given consent to say, you can use my data for whatever the specific purposes that you're collecting, and that consent has not expired. And we have some policies, authorization policies that we'll be showing you in Ranger, and then we'll also be flagging the specific types of data that are associated with this particular subjects, whether it's like PII type of data or other types of data, and how do we handle that in this environment. Okay? So this is the view from managing the user consent from Privacera's perspective. And let's shift over to Atlas. Atlas is our data governance tool, as we saw with Balaji. If I can get this thing get logged out. There we go.
It's secure.
Super secure. All right, so Atlas is our metadata and governance component within the HTTP stack. And there are some major capabilities here around a data catalog, which is searchable, and also lineage provenance information. And at the core of it, a very highly extensible type system, a modeling system for modeling any type of object, and business, technical, operational, all types of metadata around it. There's also a feature around business glossaries that is in tech preview that we will be hardening over the next few releases. And we have several collaborators here sitting in the audience who are helping us kind of polish that up as we go through this journey. So this is the 2.6 version of HTTP that was announced yesterday. And you can see here in Atlas, you can go and search on any type of objects. Here I'm searching for hive tables. And let's just open one of these up. Let's say this is a tax table. And you can see here, there's a lineage graph here, so you can see where this data came from, what happened to it, what were the processing steps, and what were the results. And tons of metadata below this around the different properties, what columns exist on this, when was it created, etc. So lots of technical metadata here. There's also the notion of classification or tagging. So in this case, we have some interesting tags here that we have created, and we've attached to different resources that are sitting in this particular cluster. So we have a credit card number. So there's a CC tag, and that's associated with this credit card number field on this particular hive table. And then there's PCI. So PCI is attached to this customers table. Oops. There's a worldwide customers table. You can go look in here. There's metadata about this. So this was created from a file that was loaded into HDFS, and there's an external process for creating that. And that has been tagged with or classified with this PCI tag. So you can, Atlas lets you go explore different assets that are sitting in your Hadoop ecosystem, the different types of objects. You can go tag them with different classification that you want. In this case, we're tagging this with the sensitivity level of the individual data that's sitting in there.
To my understanding, Hadoop is
Yes.
So you ought to be keeping that metadata also in the same cluster.
Yeah, let's take questions after we finish this. So there's additional, personal data, for example. So we have a tag called personal data. There's different types of personal data that you see here: email addresses, insurance IDs, etc. And there's also sensitive personal data. So these are tags that we can create. Creating the tags is very straightforward. You can go and click here and then add this tag, and then you can add attributes on the tag. And we allow different types of attributes here, like strings, Boolean, etc. So you can annotate different assets with different classifications and add different properties to those, so you can manage and track those in the ecosystem. Okay, so that's Atlas in sort of like a nutshell. So the things that we want to pay attention to here are the tags. So here's a way for you to go search for different assets in the data catalog, browse them. Once you find them, you can attach different tags to it and attach different properties on those tags as you deem fit. So there's some curation of this happening overall. Okay. Next piece is Ranger. So Ranger is our centralized authorization store as well as key management capability within the Hadoop platform. And what we see here is Ranger is one of the listeners of the Atlas classification process. As and when you attach tags or classifications to objects within your Hadoop ecosystem, those flow automatically to Ranger, and Ranger will inherit those tags, and it's available to author security policy against. In this case, we'll show you some examples of what we are doing here. One example here is in this cluster, which there's an analyst group in this company which is trying to analyze this data, and the data that we saw there tagged as sensitive personal data, which is this birthday column, for example. Right? So what this policy is saying is that anything that's tagged with the sensitive personal data, for the analysts, mask this and show this as a hash. So we are writing a policy based on the classification that we have done in Atlas. So the GDPR's notion of being able to understand where the data is, classify that, and then write security policies rationally based on that, we can realize that with this type of flow. Okay, so give you one more example here. So this is a very straightforward policy. Another one here is around credit cards. So you can write your own masking functions. In this case, we've just done a very trivial masking function that just reverses the digits of the credit card number. And you can write different policies, different policy conditions depending on the audience. In this case, what we're saying is wherever you see this, any asset, which is a column in Hive, let's say that's tagged with the credit card number, for the analysts, show them this way of masking it. When the analysts access this, you show it in a certain way. Public, which is the rest of the company, or anybody else, show them only the last four. And we'll see how this works when we go to a Zeppelin notebook to look at this data. Okay, so in this company, they have two personas. Let's say there's a HR persona. She's trying to analyze this customer data. And remember, these are your subjects who have given consent. So the first type of filter that you have is, has this person given consent? And if so, has the consent not expired? So those two filters are applied first. And then on top of that, we are applying this masking rules that say, how does this data additionally get presented in terms of pseudonymization and anonymization of the data? So we're applying three things here that we're showing here in this. And then to show you how go back here to show you the filtering policy. So how do we only limit the data that's shown to either the HR or the analyst group to only show those records for which we've obtained explicit consent? So there's a row filter here. So even if these users do a select star on that table, it'll get filtered down to only those rows where the Privacera consent flag has been toggled and the date of expiration of the consent is in the future. It's not in the past. So we are applying those filters here, as you can see. So the username is in this list, and the date is not within the consent date that was noted in Privacera on this page here. So these dates. Okay, so now you can see the behavior, how that translates to when the analysts are querying this. The first piece, the HR analyst is querying it, and then she's getting all the data. Even though there are like multiple rows, there are like about 50,000 rows in there, she's only seeing this explicitly, this one, because this is the one record for which the consent has been given and the consent is not expired based on the Privacera filter. That's also translated into the range of policies. In addition, we also have a pseudonymization or masking policy on the credit card number. So you can see that the credit card number, you only see the last 4 digits because that has been anonymized here. And the same view now, if the analyst queries this, there's a different set of policies in place. For them, the street addresses have been nullified and the email addresses have been hashed. And the credit card numbers we've done a trivial reverse the credit card number sort of transform just to show you that the masking policies can be extended very easily with your own Hive 2 UDFs. So with these very simple constructs, you can see that you can handle numerous parts of that legislation in terms of being able to manage the consent, manage the expiration of the consent, as well as do pseudonymization in addition to any other encryption that may be provided via the HDFS transparent data encryption products that we have on the platform. I think that this completes the first part of the demo, so Balaji.
Thanks, Venkat. So what we have covered so far is the classification in Atlas, capturing the consent and applying access policies. With the combined solution, what you can also do is we have Privacera can also help in automated discovery of data. So we have a solution which can go and run on top of Hadoop or databases, other systems, automatically classify data. So really want to find out where personal data is. That's your first step. And then the solution can then classify data based on the nomenclatures you have. So GDPR classifies personal data as something you can identify an individual. There are certain sensitive personal data, which are racial data or any other data, which are very sensitive. They have a different classification. So you would need to come up with your classifications within the organizations, and those classifications can drive some of the controls. And so Privacera can help you in auto-classifying the data. After the classification, this data is pushed into Atlas, and that's the tags you would see. So you would see a discovery, classification, Atlas, Ranger, and then you will have the controls in place. So that's the cycle of things that you will see. The other things you would probably need to think about, like I said before, is how do you monitor, once you've given access to the data, how you keep monitoring the access part of the data. And one of the things Privacera does is it collects audits from various sources, Hadoop and other sources. We sit on top of a big data engine, and we constantly find behavior based on a certain classification of data. So we'll discover sensitive data and then analyze how this data is being used over a period of time. And there's a behavior baseline put in for every classification type. So if you have personal data, sensitive personal data, there will be a certain behavior. And then we find anomalies and norms on top of that. And those norms can indicate a potential breach or exfiltration of data. A breach in GDPR is not just taking data out. Any unauthorized access, any other aspects of potentially which could be an insider threat is also classified as a breach. So you would need to think about a broader definition of breach here than traditional security terms that you would hear outside, where you would need to think about all these aspects about who is accessing data, are there any unauthorized access, and what we can help is we can monitor that. We produce alerts based on a user or a classification of data. Those alerts can be configured to either automatically block or send a notification out, and those can be analyzed further by the SOC analysts and drill down based on the alerts. They can drill down and find out what kind of alerts is coming in, what is a high or medium, and those are driven internally by different machine learning policies that we follow. We also collect a lot of audits as a sync. We collect from Ranger, we collect from Hadoop, we collect from other sources. And we have an ability to show you, drill down more forensics into how the data is being monitored. So the audit gives you more ability to drill down further if you get an alert and other aspects of that. Quickly, in terms of other policies, one of the two types of policies that we configure in Privacera, one is called machine learning policies, which are auto-behavioral based. It's based on a threshold and a baseline. So we look at certain parameters around access, around other aspects, very similar elements that's been called out in GDPR. The other elements we look at is around appropriate use of whether a particular policy has a purpose defined with it. So when you're collecting data from individuals, you're collecting it for a purpose. And GDPR mandates that once you're collecting a consent, you have to do it per purpose. So if you're collecting for data science purpose or research purpose, you have to explicitly put that in the consent notice. And then once you're analyzing the data, you have to make sure that it's being only used for that purpose. And how do you do that? So there are certain ways you can do manual audits, but there are automated functions you can do where you can map out what users are analyzing the data and map out the purpose of the user versus the data set. And that can come out as another alerts. If purpose is being violated, that can come out as a different alerts. There are different ways you would need to analyze the access monitoring once you've given access to the data. And those are the things that will be important in GDPR. So these are some of the elements of it. Obviously, I mean, we are happy to work with you offline and come up with more broader sets. But these are some of the ways you can start thinking about it right now. Okay? So with this, we will kind of wrap up the presentation. And you can find more information in these links, both on the Hortonworks site as well as with Privacera. We'll encourage you to check more sessions on some of the areas we did. There's an Atlas session coming up later today. Shrikant is doing a session on cloud. Some of the aspects will be touched again. And tomorrow, after the conference, we have birds of feather sessions where we're going to talk about some of the aspects on security and governance, especially on GDPR. With this, we'll end this and we'll take questions. This gentleman had a question, so we'll probably start with him.
I put my question. How do you keep the metadata, and are they larger than the actual data that you need to protect?
So we collect the metadata, and that is actually stored with Hadoop itself. So all of the data that comes in is in Atlas, for example, there's a graph layer. There's a Titan graph database, and then underneath that is HBase, so that can scale with your cluster. And in the case of Ranger, we collect a lot of audits. That is also scalable. We write those back into HDFS, so it can scale with your cluster. So, yeah, go ahead.
I come from an industry where there's a lot of legacy software running, and the majority of our data sits in files. And I would say that also the majority of our data is also unexplored. We don't know whether there is private information or not yet in there because we are still not fully literate. And how would you, I mean, how are we supposed to what would be your suggestion to tackle this kind of
So is it primarily unstructured data or structured data?
I mean, there's always some structure, but the format can...
Yeah.
So what I would recommend is you would have to invest in some sort of discovery around the data, right? So because the chances of personal data being there, you will only find out once you've gone through an exercise. So you can either do a manual exercise of going through every file or invest in a data discovery kind of solution which runs through the files and understands and classifies data. I think that's step one. Once you understood what kind of consent and what kind of data it is, you would need to go back to your legal team and see if this is something they need to, if you already collected consent, or is it something you need to go back, right? So if you have not collected consent in the first go, you may want to go back and collect the consent from the individual person. Otherwise, you would not be able to use the data and you would need to archive it. So there are certain ramifications, but the first step is always finding out where is your personal data. And
if you don't know where it is, then all of the steps are moot, right?
Yeah,
so that's the first task is to discover.
So I would say either manually or through an automated solution. I don't know the scale of files you have, but you would need to probably look at a step process here where you would need to understand the data. There is no workaround around this.
And the discovery solution also needs to be a little bit more precise so it can deal with the sensitive data first class. There are a lot of discovery solutions out there that would do general purpose classification, but you want ones that have high fidelity towards the sensitive type of data that GDPR and other regulations deal with.
Sorry, we can go with you, then we'll go to the back. Go.
Do you have any indication of where does GDPR draws the line between automatic processing and manual processing? Because if just a operator clicks to trigger an automatic process, that's manual or not?
Yeah, I mean it's kind of ambiguous right now. So automated processing is there is no human involved. You're going to a website, it's running big data analytics or predictive analytics in the back, and it's giving you predictive. So if you're a Google kind of website or an ad, you're being served an ad, that is automated processing. A manual processing is somebody running a query manually. So that is the kind of definition. But I would assume there will be some clarification already requested in terms of more language, and there will be coming more. But
I think it's more a legal question than actually an implementation
it's
question.
a technical question, but
I think
yeah.
it's concerning taking the decisions. How we collected the information for the decision is not relevant, but a person has to sign. So
Correct.
Yep.
Right. So a person has to sign, and now if a person has written a code and it's running an automated person, that is probably, is it automated or is it manual or semi-automatic? There's some definitions which will get more clarity. But right now, any kind of automatic without any person getting involved is classified as automated profiling. So that is restricted, and even within manual profiling, you need a person present. I'll go to that person in the back and come back to you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you. So basically 2 questions. Does GDPR already provides a taxonomy classification of what they mean are personal data?
Yes.
And the second thing would be then, how does this masking the ranger affect the performance for doing the necessary processes?
So can you repeat the second part? Sorry.
Yeah, so how is the performance impacted by the ranger's policy?
Okay.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So the first part of your question, yes. GDPR has explicit classification on personal data and sensitive data, which is good.
But they do have, there's some gray areas there. So they say anything that is of, let's say, societal dimension to it. So that's very broad and very vague. And there's things like political affiliation, all kinds of stuff that they include. So I would say there is a sort of a loose taxonomy there. It's not firmed up. So you would have to actually go back and figure out, with the compliance legal teams, what are the ramifications for the specific data that you're dealing with. To your second point, around the Ranger performance, Ranger's masking is very, very closely tied to Hive. So Ranger works through the mechanism of plugins, which are resident with that particular service that they authorize. And because they run in the same process, the overhead is almost negligible. So we do that in place on the Hive server itself, in this case. So on Hive Server 2, this plugin runs. So as soon as the query is almost even compiled in, the Ranger plugin is invoked, and we can do the authorizations at that point. Because it's enforced in place and as close as possible to that process, we don't see a huge overhead. We have customers who are running thousands of policies with 100,000 users, et cetera, so without issues on this.
You had a question. We'll go.
Yes, with Privacera, we shipped within the HDP stack because it looked like it was integrated with Apache Atlas.
Yeah, so we are a separate product. We are a partner to Hortonworks, so we have done integrations into Atlas. So we have done from a partner community perspective. We will integrate with Atlas or any other metadata store, but it's a separate product.
Okay, it's separate.
Right. So we do have, for Atlas and Ranger, we run sort of a curation process so that we collect these partner solutions that we've proven reference solutions, which do integrations with parts of our stack in Hortonworks. In the case of Atlas, we have what we call a GovReady program. So we have curated solutions that have been proven to work and integrate with Atlas, for example, and on the security side with Ranger and Kerberos and Knots, et cetera. So we definitely, if you are looking for certain recommendations around those would be a starting point. Say these solutions are vetted, and as a part of the certification process, we also evaluate the integrations, the two-way integrations, what data can be pushed into those systems and pulled out of those systems, and what kind of interfaces exist there. Privacera is one of the ones that we have already gone through the process of certifying on the Atlas side.
Sorry, you had a question.
Does 2.6 or Privacera provide something for Spark? Because when we use automatic processes in Spark, it doesn't go through Hive Server 2. So anything the things you presented are not possible currently.
So it is possible in 2.6 if you're using, it is a tech preview feature we have in 2.6. If you're using Spark SQL and you go through Hive LLAP, all of the Ranger policies that you see will be enforced behind the scenes. So you don't have to do anything additional. You define the policies once. But that, even though Hive LLAP just went GA in 2.6, the Spark SQL part of it is still under tech preview. And I don't know if Vinay is here, but we can talk to Vinay Shukla. He's the Spark PM.
Yeah.
What is it like?
Right here. It's planned for a subsequent release, 3.0 and beyond.
So I think we just run out of time, I think, unfortunately, but we are available here. We can take questions if you want to just come in the front.
Yeah.
But thank you so much
Thank you
for coming in.